You're with Newsnight. A new survey has painted a bleak picture of the plight of domestic workers in the country and on the continent. A number of them are losing their jobs as employers emigrate or battle to pay them. Sweep South is a digital platform that allows customers to book domestic workers. The new findings are contained in their survey of about 8,000 domestic workers. Luke Kannemeyer is the Chief Operating Officer of Sweep South. He joins me now for more on that survey. Luke, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Let me start here. Some of the findings really are quite staggering. I mean, from being underpaid as a domestic worker to working illegally long hours, it just doesn't get any better, does it?
No, good evening, Devin. Good evening to the viewers. Unfortunately, there's not much good to say. Is that we had started the survey 5 years ago, hoping to track progress in the domestic worker industry. We had COVID hit. That was obviously an upset to the market. We had hoped for a recovery, but unfortunately, given global circumstances at the moment and the fallout from the pandemic, the story to tell is even more dire than during the pandemic itself.
And as I said, there were some sort of staggering findings that you made. Just a little bit of a background on the survey. Who exactly did you speak to when you collated this information?
So we generally, as a platform, have a large number of workers that apply to the platform. So we have in excess of around 200,000 applications. And that's the sort of cohort we'd look at as workers who are not on the platform. So generally a sample that operate within our main markets of the urban centers across South Africa. We then look at workers within our own platform, and then those who've decided then to depart the platform, for us to then follow their journey, that what are their circumstances, if they still work in the industry, how are they doing, what are the conditions that they experience, has their time on the platform at least led to an improvement in their pay and conditions beyond the platform.
Let's get into some of the details now. I mean, I've been reading that a quarter of the country's domestic workers participating in that survey say they lost their jobs in the last year. Now, on the one end, you can imagine what happens to a household off that domestic when a job is lost. But I guess on the other end, it reveals that employees, the people that employ these domestics, are just unable to pay them. And is that a significant trend that you're picking up?
Unfortunately, there's no quite non-emotive word to describe this. Obviously, I've joined this business because I care deeply about the industry, but it's honestly a bloodbath. It's a notable and excessive drop in jobs. Around 25%, as you say, have now lost their jobs in the industry, but that's on the back of around 50% of men who'd work as domestic workers. So typically that would be gardeners, outdoor cleaners and whatnot, have lost their jobs in the last 3 months. So yeah, what we are seeing are dire circumstances play out in the industry. And as you say, yes, domestic workers earn a portion of their employer's salary. So however the middle class is doing will largely determine their circumstances, and the sustained pressure that middle class households have been put under has meant that they're now sacrificing certain items, and the domestic workers unfortunately are being caught now in this reduction in budgets across the full spectrum of South African society. And unfortunately for them, this now often leaves them in dire circumstances as we depict, where they're now left without any income at all, or purely access to our social security system, which thankfully is rather robust, but is still far short of what constitutes a living wage for these workers and their families.
And when you go beyond that, it really is jaw-dropping to see that things like verbal and physical abuse continues. I mean, I'm wondering whether or not you get a sense that law enforcement has been effective to help them, because that sort of abuse is still continuing in many households, isn't it?
So similar to how we see abuse happening within their own homes amongst domestic workers, is that the power dynamics here between partners is even more pronounced when one is poor or working for an employer that holds a lot of the power. And this is something that we look to try and solve as a platform, where we let our workers rate their clients and the clients get to rate the workers. So it's a two-sided relationship. But unfortunately, most relationships are not of that nature. So while one can definitely say that law enforcement needs significant improvement here in terms of their response, because we have had notable instances on the platform where we've tried to escalate things to authorities and not always receive the response that we expected, or that that is enshrined within our laws and constitution, that our workers haven't been afforded those rights there. But certainly most of it just goes unreported. We try and provide an anonymous survey to try and solicit these depictions of what's actually happening in the market. But for the most part, these will never be reported instances to law enforcement, but often won't actually be reported to the employer themselves as communication or treatment that they're uncomfortable with, purely because they're so dependent on this income and are afraid of losing that.
Yeah, it's a sad story, but I want to go back to the wages, Luke, of domestic workers. How rife is the underpaying of domestics when one considers the minimum wage?
So this is a complex story to tell, where we saw the increases in the minimum wage of domestic workers over the year generally correlated with an improvement in wages of domestic workers. But what we saw this past year was that the national minimum wage of domestic workers was then brought up to the same rate as all workers within the economy, which was a decision that we completely agreed with. Domestic workers are no less workers than anyone else in their economy. But what we did see then was a changing of trends, where typically in some of the other African markets we work, minimum wage is seen as largely aspirational. We had seen that in urban centers in South Africa, people had normally adhered to minimum wage. And honestly, what we were pushing the market towards was a living wage. Like we've shown in our survey, domestic workers, many of them are single parents, are main breadwinners, supporting up to 5 dependents on average. And so the income that they're reliant on is not just for themselves, but for a number of individuals that it remains important. So this is, where we have seen that South Africans were keeping up. And there's a notable trend now that South African households are I wouldn't necessarily say always underpaying. What we also see is underemployment becomes rife. So you're now a permanent worker, but actually we drop the number of days you have. And many domestic workers then, because of the nature of the market, are not able to replace those days. So are still then left with an income that falls far below what would be prescribed in minimum wage legislation, and even further away from what would be considered a living wage.
Yep, no, it's not a pleasant story indeed. Well, thanks very much indeed for that update there.